Before the locks, there was only the roar. For countless years, the St. Mary's River threw itself down a rocky stairway between two great lakes, dropping some 21 feet in less than a mile. The Ojibwe called this place Bawatigong, the place of the rapids, and fished its churning waters from birch-bark canoes. To travel here was to portage, to carry everything you owned around water that would not be crossed. The rapids were beautiful, and they were a wall. Lake Superior sat higher than the lakes below, sealed off by that one violent mile of falling water. Furs, then copper, then iron ore all piled up at the water's edge, waiting for hands to haul them overland. The whole promise of the upper country hung on solving a single stubborn stretch of river. In 1797, a fur company cut the first small lock on the Canadian side, barely big enough for a canoe. It was burned in the War of 1812 and largely forgotten. For decades afterward, cargo was still dragged on rollers and ox carts around the rushing water. The problem did not go away. It simply waited for men bold enough to answer it. That answer came in the 1850s, carried by a young engineer named Charles Harvey. He had come north to sell scales and instead found a fortune in waiting locked behind the rapids. Where others saw an obstacle, Harvey saw a channel, and he set out to convince investors that stone and water could be made to obey. The work began in 1853, and it was brutal. Harvey gathered a workforce of hundreds, then thousands, in a wilderness that offered little but cold and rock. They blasted bedrock through a merciless winter, battled cholera, and watched supplies dwindle at the far edge of the map. The men dug by hand what the river had refused to give for millennia. There were nights when the whole enterprise seemed doomed. Perils ran thin, laborers deserted, and the frozen ground fought every pick. Yet Harvey held the line, driving the crews forward with a stubbornness that bordered on faith. Slowly, a pair of masonry chambers rose beside the roaring water. In June of 1855, the state lock opened at last. The steamer Illinois eased into the chamber, the gates closed behind her, and the water lifted her gently to the level of Lake Superior. In that quiet rise, no roar, no portage, no oxen, 1,000 years of impossibility simply ended. The rapids had been tamed. What followed was a flood of a different kind. Iron ore from the Marquette Range poured down through the locks and into the furnaces of a growing nation. Ships that once ended their journeys at the rapids now passed through in minutes. The trickle of commerce became a torrent that would build railroads, skyscrapers, and warships. But the ships kept growing, and the locks had to grow with them. Where Harvey's chambers had served an age of wooden steamers, new generations of engineers arrived to answer new demands. The Whitesell, the Poe, the Davis, the Sabin, each lock bore a name and stretched longer than the last. The Army Corps of Engineers took charge, rebuilding the passage again and again. The Poe lock, opened in 1896 and rebuilt grander in 1968, became the Great Gateway. Only through its long chamber could the largest freighters, the 1,000-footers, pass at all. These engineers worked in the shadow of Harvey's original gamble, refining what he had begun with dynamite and desperation into a machine of astonishing precision. Consider the elegance of it. No pumps, no engines to raise the water. The locks work by gravity alone, letting Lake Superior's own weight fill and empty the chambers. A vessel of 60,000 tons floats upward on nothing more than the patient flow of the river it once could not cross. It is engineering that has learned to whisper rather than shout. Today the Sioux locks move more tonnage than almost any waterway on Earth, most of it iron ore bound for the mills that make America's steel. The freighters glide through where canoes once portaged and oxen once strained. Tourists lean on the railings and watch a giant rise, quietly, out of the lower river. The rapids still run beside the locks, a narrow ribbon of white water left untamed, as if to remember what the river once was. Anglers wade there in the spray, standing where the Ojibwe stood, in the roar that named the place. The old violence and the new order share the same shoreline. Charles Harvey died in 1912, having lived to see his gamble become a lifeline for a continent. His name is carved into the story of the Sioux, alongside the many engineers who never stopped rebuilding his dream. They did not conquer the river so much as reach an understanding with it. And in the hush of a locked chamber filling with water, that old agreement is honored still.